In this video we're going to look at exchange. We'll look at why it happens, how two parties can both be made better off through exchange, and the role of middlemen in facilitating it. The reason why we exchange goods and services are because people place different valuations on the same goods, and whenever there's a disagreement about how much something is worth, there's a potential gain from trade by transferring ownership. I'm going to use the concept of marginal value here. We can draw a marginal value curve. We'll look on the y-axis, we're going to look at price. Basically, this is the amount of alternative goods that a consumer would be able to purchase. On the x-axis, we're going to look at a particular good, in our case, eggs. Marginal value curve looks something like this, and there's three key properties that we can focus on. The first is that it's downward sloping, and this is due to diminishing marginal utility, which is the idea that as we consume more eggs, the lower the value we place on additional eggs. This is because the first eggs that we have, we put to more pressing needs than later ones. The position of the curve, or the height, is going to be influenced by wealth. So generally we would expect that if our wealth goes up, then the curve is going to shift upwards. That's if there's a positive relationship between our wealth and the demand that we have for the good. The third key point is that tastes differ, and therefore the slope and the position of the marginal value curve will be different for different consumers. We can look at two different consumers now with an example. Let's start off by looking at a consumer called Anne. This is her marginal value curve, it's downward sloping. And let's imagine that she starts off with 20 eggs. As we can see, the value that she places on her 20th egg is 12 pence. As she consumes more eggs, she places a lower valuation on additional eggs. We've also got Bert, who also has a marginal value curve that's downward sloping, but the 20th egg that he consumes, he only places a value of 6 pence. The basic principle here is that if personal valuations differ at the initial endowment, then mutually advantageous trades potentially exist. To make both parties better off, trade occurs until the person with the higher marginal valuation acquires an amount until her marginal valuation decreases to equal that of the increasing use value of the seller. In other words, as Anne consumes more eggs, her marginal value falls. As Bert relinquishes eggs, his marginal value rises, and so they can trade up until the point at which their marginal value is the same. In our case, we can see that Anne is willing to pay 8 pence up to and including her 24th egg, and Bert is willing to relinquish eggs at 8 pence each up to and including his 16th egg. Anne's quite happy to pay more than 8 pence for her 21st, 22nd, 23rd egg. She values the eggs more than she values the money or the value of alternative goods and services. For Bert, it's the opposite. The area that's below the marginal value curve and above the price line is what we refer to as consumer surplus. This is the excess of value that Anne places on the good over and above the price that she has to pay. We can also look at Bert and see that the area above his marginal value curve and below the price at which he's exchanging goods, the black triangle here, is the same for him. He's also deriving some surplus. We can also see the gains from trade by superimposing these two curves onto one graph, which looks something like this. What we have here is Anne's marginal value curve from before. As we move from left to right, Anne is acquiring eggs. All that we've done now is that we've switched Bert's, and so Bert looks upward sloping, but that's just because we've inverted this such that as Bert is acquiring eggs, he's moving from right to left. The total existing number of eggs is 40. This is measured by the entire line. As we move from left to right, Anne is acquiring eggs and Bert is giving them up. As we move from right to left, Bert is acquiring eggs and Anne is giving them up. Any trading to the right means that Anne is acquiring eggs from Bert. Putting both Bert and Anne on the same graph makes it easier to see that at our initial point, Q1, where they both have 20 eggs each, Anne has a higher marginal value than Bert. Anne's marginal value is 12 pence, Bert's marginal value is 6 pence. This is making it very clear the potential gains from trade. Note that the exchange here benefits both people as if there'd been a magical, costless increase in the number of goods available. Trade performs the same function as the creation of more goods. It generates value. Trade slides each person along their marginal value curve up to where the values are equal, and this will deliver the equilibrium sustaining price, which in our case is 8 pence. Anne is moving down her curve, Bert is moving up his. We can also incorporate Q star, which is the final resting point. This is after Anne has accumulated 4 eggs, so that she now has 24. Bert has relinquished 4 eggs, so now he has 16. At Q star, both Anne and Bert have been made better off. We can also introduce the consumer surplus again and can see the extent to which Anne is benefiting from trade. And we can also look at Bert's consumer surplus. Now he is the person that's relinquishing eggs. We can think of him as a producer. This is now producer surplus, and we can see the extent to which he's benefiting from trade. Moving from Q1 to Q star is an efficient reallocation of goods, and we're going to use Q star as a reference point to see the absolute maximum amount of gains that can be made through exchange. Now let's introduce transaction costs. In the real world, it's costly to participate in exchange, and therefore the price of a good isn't the whole cost of locating it and buying it. What we can see now is our original market between Anne and Bert, but we're going to introduce some transaction costs. Let's say, for example, that Anne has to spend 1 pence per unit of the good, purchasing petrol, for example, to get to the marketplace. Therefore, the full price of the good for her is not 8 pence, it's 9 pence. She'd only buy the amount of eggs that bring her marginal value to 9 pence. We can also imagine that Bert has some transaction costs to bear. Transaction costs such as search, negotiation, contract enforcement, and let's say that these amount to 0.5 pence per unit. Therefore, his net realised selling cost is not 8 pence, but it's actually 7.5 pence. He's only going to sell as many eggs that leave him with a personal marginal value of 7.5. We can see the original consumer surplus and producer surplus in the diagram, but if the price of $8 of 8 pence, creates a diversion because of the transaction costs, we now have a reduced amount of consumer surplus for Anne, and we have a reduced amount of producer surplus for Bert. Instead of going from Q1 to Q star, we only end up at Q2. Now let's introduce middlemen. So this is the diagram from before. What we're going to see is how a middleman allows the trader's gains to be larger than they would be without the middleman. This is only relevant for a world in which we have transaction costs, but this is the real world. Previously, it cost $1.50 for Anne and Bert to perform the exchange, the difference between the 9 pence and 7.5 pence. Imagine that we have a third party, let's say a delivery boy, who enters and specialises in buying eggs from sellers and then taking them to the buyers. Now let's imagine that the delivery boy can buy off Bert for 7.75 pence and can sell to Anne for 8.5 pence. This leaves some profit for the delivery person, and crucially it allows us to move from Q star to Q3. The lighter areas in the diagram show the original consumer surplus and producer surplus. The darker triangles or smaller triangles show us the consumer surplus and producer surplus in a world of transaction costs. And now we can see the increase in consumer surplus that's brought about by the introduction of the middleman. Similarly, the increase in the producer surplus for Bert due to the middleman as we move closer to the original hypothetical starting point. The presence of the middleman creates more trading possibilities because Q3 is bigger than Q2, and it moves us closer to the efficient position of Q star. And we can see here the buyers benefit as a result of the middleman and the sellers benefit as a result of the middleman. Competition between middlemen could reduce this spread even further, such that we move even closer to Q star again. But note that Q star is not necessarily somewhere that we're going to actually achieve. In a world of positive transaction costs, Q star is unobtainable, but the presence of middlemen is moving us closer to it. Middlemen aren't increasing costs to consumers, they're actually reducing the costs of exchange. You can think of an example. In a world of zero transaction cost, it's intuitively obvious that the presence of a middleman introduces costs into the system. However, in the real world, where transaction costs are positive, they reduce them. For example, it may be the case that if you go direct to a farm to buy eggs from the farmer, they cost 10 pence. And maybe if you go to a supermarket, then they cost 30 pence. And we can think about some of the costs that are involved with the supermarket's presence as being the price difference between going direct to the farm versus going to the intermediary. The main problem, though, is you are not at the farm. It costs time and it costs money to go direct to the farm. Let's imagine that it costs 50 pence to get the kids in the car, get to the farm and buy your eggs. The difference is that you're probably already going to be at the supermarket because there's lots and lots of other goods and services that you wish to purchase that are available at the supermarket. In a world of zero transaction costs, middlemen seem to raise or introduce costs. In the real world, they are competing to make us move to the most efficient outcome with higher producer surplus and higher consumer surplus than we otherwise would have. I hope you find that presentation to be exciting.